Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your country owes more money than the entire value of everything it produces in a year. A debt so enormous that if it were divided equally among every American, each person would owe tens of thousands of dollars. Yet despite carrying one of the largest debts in human history, the United States remains the world's biggest economy and one of the most powerful nations on earth. But this raises a fascinating question. How did the richest and most powerful country in the world end up owing so much money? And perhaps even more importantly, could America's debt eventually become its biggest threat? Today, we're going to uncover the shocking story behind America's exploding national debt, how it grew to unimaginable levels, why it keeps increasing every second, and whether this financial mountain could one day cause serious problems not only for Americans, but for the entire world. Because believe it or not, the answer affects everyone. What exactly is national debt? Before we understand why America's debt has become so massive, we first need to understand what national debt actually means. Many people hear the word debt and immediately think of credit cards, bank loans, or mortgages, but government debt works somewhat differently. Think about your own household. Suppose your family earns $50,000 a year but spends $55,000. That extra $5,000 has to come from somewhere. Maybe you borrow it from a bank. Governments work in a similar way. Every year, the US government collects money through taxes, but it also spends money on many things: the military, roads and bridges, social security, healthcare programs, education, scientific research, disaster relief, and hundreds of other responsibilities. When government spending becomes greater than government income, it creates a gap. To fill that gap, the government borrows money. Over time, all of those borrowed amounts add together. That total amount is known as the national debt. And in America's case, that number has reached truly staggering levels. But surprisingly, having debt isn't automatically a disaster. In fact, almost every major country on earth has national debt. Japan has debt. Britain has debt. France has debt. India has debt. China has debt. The difference lies in how much debt a country has and whether it can continue managing it. And that's where things become interesting. What is the difference between debt and deficit? Many economists use a bathtub analogy. The deficit is the water flowing into the bathtub each year, while the debt is all the water that is accumulated inside the bathtub over time. In other words, deficits are yearly shortfalls, while debt is the total result of decades of borrowing. A number so big, it is hard to imagine. Economists often compare huge numbers to time. 1 million seconds is about 11 days, 1 billion seconds is about 32 years, and 1 trillion seconds is over 31,000 years. This comparison helps people understand how enormous trillion-dollar figures really are. How does America borrow money? Unlike ordinary people, governments don't simply walk into a bank and ask for a loan. Instead, the U.S. Treasury sells special financial instruments called Treasury securities. These include Treasury bills, Treasury notes, and Treasury bonds. Think of them as I owe us. An investor gives money to the government. In return, the government promises to repay that money later, along with interest. And who buys these securities? American citizens, banks, pension funds, insurance companies, investment firms, the Federal Reserve, and even foreign governments. Countries around the world invest in U.S. Treasury bonds because they are considered among the safest financial assets on the planet, which means that despite its enormous debt, the United States can still borrow money relatively easily. But this raises another question. If borrowing is so easy, why doesn't America just borrow unlimited amounts forever? Well, because debt comes with a cost, and that cost is called interest. The hidden problem. Interest. Imagine borrowing money from a friend. Eventually, you have to repay not only the original amount, but possibly some extra money as well. That extra amount is interest. Governments face the same reality. Every year, the United States must spend hundreds of billions of dollars simply paying interest on its existing debt. Money spent on interest cannot be used elsewhere. It cannot build schools. It cannot repair roads. It cannot fund scientific breakthroughs. Instead, it goes towards servicing old borrowing. And as the debt grows larger, interest payments also become larger. Some experts worry that in the future, interest costs alone could consume a huge portion of government spending. But here's the strange part. America has been carrying debt for more than 2 centuries. And despite repeated warnings throughout history, the country hasn't collapsed. So why are economists and experts becoming increasingly concerned now? What makes today's situation different from the past? To answer that question, we need to go back to the very beginning, back to the birth of the United States itself. Because believe it or not, America's debt story began almost as soon as the country was born. And that story is far more dramatic than most people realize. A new enemy emerges. By the end of World War II, the United States had emerged as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. But peace did not last for long. A new rivalry soon began. On one side stood the United States, on the other stood the Soviet Union. This struggle, known as the Cold War, would last for nearly half a century and shape the modern world. Although the two superpowers never fought each other directly, they competed in almost every area imaginable. Military power, technology, space exploration, nuclear weapons, economic influence, and maintaining that competition came with an enormous price tag. The cost of being a superpower. Throughout the Cold War, the United States spent massive amounts of money on defense. Thousands of nuclear weapons were built. Military bases were established around the world. New fighter jets, submarines, and aircraft carriers entered service. America fought wars in Korea and Vietnam. Billions of dollars were poured into scientific research and space programs. The famous space race with the Soviet Union led to incredible achievements, including the moon landing in 1969. But all of these accomplishments required huge government spending. As a result, debt continued to rise. Still, thanks to strong economic growth, many Americans remained optimistic. The economy was expanding, businesses were thriving, and for decades, the debt seemed manageable. But major changes were beginning to appear. Rise of social programs. Supporters argue that programs like Medicare and Medicaid lifted millions of Americans out of poverty and expanded access to healthcare. Critics, however, argue that these programs created long-term obligations that continue to put pressure on federal finances. The troubled 1970s. Many economists describe the 1970s as the worst of both worlds because America experienced both high inflation and weak economic growth at the same time. A phenomenon known as stagflation. Oil shocks and monetary policy mistakes are often cited as major causes. The Reagan era. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became president. His economic policies aimed to stimulate growth through lower taxes and increased defense spending. Supporters believed that cutting taxes would encourage businesses to invest, create jobs, and ultimately generate more government revenue. At the same time the Cold War was intensifying, military spending rose sharply. The United States invested heavily in advanced weapons systems and defense technologies. However, there was one problem. Government spending remained high while tax revenues declined. As a result, annual budget deficits grew dramatically. Throughout the 1980s, the national debt increased at a pace that worried many economists. Critics warned that excessive borrowing could create problems in the future. But supporters argued that economic growth would eventually solve the issue. The debate continues even today. The end of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was over. America had emerged victorious. Many people expected military spending to decline and government finances to improve. And for a while, things did seem to move in a positive direction. The 1990s witnessed one of the strongest economic expansions in American history. The rise of computers and the internet transformed businesses. Productivity increased. Millions of new jobs were created. Tax revenues surged. And something remarkable happened. America runs a surplus. During the late 1990s, under President Bill Clinton, the United States achieved budget surpluses. This meant the government was actually collecting more money than it was spending. For a brief period, some experts even predicted that the national debt might eventually disappear. Imagine that. After centuries of borrowing, America seemed to be heading toward a future with little or no debt. But history had other plans. Because the new millennium would bring events that nobody could have predicted. September 11 and the War on Terror. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks shocked the United States. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. The attacks changed America forever. In response, the United States launched military operations in Afghanistan. Later, the Iraq War began. These conflicts would last for years. Trillions of dollars were spent on military operations, veterans care, intelligence programs, and national security. At the same time, tax cuts were implemented. As spending increased and revenues decreased, deficits returned. The national debt started climbing once again. But an even bigger financial disaster was approaching, one that would shake the entire world. The 2008 financial crisis. In 2008, the global financial system nearly collapsed. Major banks faced bankruptcy, stock markets crashed, millions of Americans lost their homes, unemployment soared, fear spread throughout the world. Suddenly, the government faced a terrible situation. If nothing was done, economists feared that the crisis could turn into another Great Depression. To prevent disaster, the government took extraordinary measures. Banks were rescued. Stimulus packages were introduced. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates. Trillions of dollars were injected into the economy. These actions helped stabilize the financial system, but they also came at a cost. Government borrowing increased rapidly, and for the first time, many economists began warning that America might be entering a new era of permanently rising debt. What is a default? Financial experts often describe default as the nightmare scenario that policymakers try to avoid. Because U.S. Treasury bonds are considered among the safest assets in the world, even a temporary default could shake global markets and undermine confidence in the American economy. Why investors still trust America? Many investors say they trust the United States not because its debt is small, but because of its history. For more than 2 centuries, America has generally honored its obligations. Combined with the strength of the US dollar and the size of its economy, this reputation helps explain why investors continue to buy US debt. A changing world. The global economy is changing. New powers are rising. China has become the world's second largest economy. Technological competition is intensifying. Populations are aging. Healthcare costs are rising. And governments face growing demands from their citizens. At the same time, interest payments are consuming larger portions of national budgets. This means future leaders may face difficult choices: raise taxes, reduce spending, borrow even more, or attempt some combination of all three. None of these options are politically easy, which is why debt debates have become increasingly intense in Washington. Possible futures. So what happens next? Nobody knows with certainty, but economists generally discuss several possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Continued stability. The economy continues growing, productivity improves, technology drives innovation, and debt remains manageable. Under this scenario, America continues to thrive despite its enormous obligations. Scenario 2. Slow financial pressure. Debt keeps increasing. Interest payments rise steadily. Government budgets become more constrained. Economic growth slows somewhat, but no dramatic crisis occurs. Instead, the country gradually faces tougher choices and lower flexibility. Scenario 3. Major economic shock. A severe recession, geopolitical conflict, or financial crisis causes borrowing costs to rise sharply. Investor confidence weakens. Economic pain increases. And policymakers are forced to make difficult decisions. While most experts do not consider this the most likely outcome, they acknowledge that risks always exist. What history teaches us? History provides an important lesson. For more than 200 years, people have predicted America's decline. During the Civil War, many feared the country would collapse. During the Great Depression, confidence was shattered. After World War II, debt reached record levels. During the Cold War, enormous military spending raised concerns. Following the 2008 financial crisis, many predicted disaster. And yet the United States adapted and continued growing. This doesn't guarantee that future challenges will be easy, but it does remind us that economies are dynamic and constantly evolving. The bigger question, perhaps the most important question, isn't how large is America's debt, but rather, can America continue generating the innovation, productivity, and economic growth necessary to support that debt? Because debt is ultimately a reflection of confidence. Confidence in institutions, confidence in the economy, and confidence in the future. As long as that confidence remains strong, the system continues functioning. But confidence, once lost, can be incredibly difficult to restore. Conclusion: America's national debt is one of the most fascinating financial stories in human history. It began with the struggle for independence more than 2 centuries ago. It expanded through wars, crises, and periods of extraordinary growth. Today, it stands at levels that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Some see danger, others see opportunity. Some predict crisis, others predict continued resilience. And perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the story so compelling. Because the future of America's debt is not just about numbers, it's about economics, politics, innovation, global power, and ultimately, the future of the world's most influential nation. And the answer to whether America's debt becomes its greatest challenge, or simply another chapter in its long history of adaptation, has yet to be written. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Do you think America's debt is a ticking time bomb? Or is it a problem that the world's largest economy can continue to manage?